God's work does not depend on particular governments being in power.
This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and I'm joined by Dr. Richard Blackaby on this very special election episode.
Election Day podcast, yep.
Yeah, how exciting, Richard. We record this the day before the election, so we don't obviously know the outcome, but we thought...
Even if we had done it on the day of the election, we probably wouldn't know the outcome for quite a while.
Probably not, not. But, our podcast releases on Tuesdays, and it just so happens that this one is an election day, and we thought, hey, why not talk about elections?
Yeah, which has certainly been very much on people's minds, and so this podcast is not so much to try to debrief on what happened, the results, but more to say, regardless of the results, are there some things that Christians need to be doing as they enter into this time? I know there's a lot of apprehension, a lot of people very concerned, fearful, and suspicious, and all kinds of different feelings swirling about. And perhaps it's been a long, long time in American history since there's been an election that was so fraught with very, very different views and polarization, and such what, at least before Election Day, appears to be a very tight race that could go either way. So I just thought I would just give a few thoughts, and of course, I just think it never hurts just to stop and take a few moments to reflect. Oftentimes, I think we respond without having reflected. We just use our gut reaction sometimes, and that doesn't always. Our gut does not always take us to the right places, and so
you're saying my gut's not reliable.
So I think sometimes it's just good, but even before election results are coming in, just to stop and just reflect on some things that we do know. We don't know the outcome yet, but there are some other things that we do know. And so, I was thinking, first of all, just regardless of what happens on Election Day, it's probably not the beginning of the apocalypse. The end of the earth as we know it probably is not going to take place Election Day. And I know that there's just, with politics, the rhetoric so often just keeps going to greater and greater lengths, that it's the end of democracy as we know it, could be the end of life as we know it. And this is probably going to be the next of many, many 4-year cycle elections that we've had, some much more memorable and impactful than others. But nonetheless, I think it probably is helpful if we just kind of scale things down a little bit to say that more than likely 4 years from now, there will be another election, and there'll be another person perhaps elected at that point. And so just kind of keep it in context. I was thinking about the famous passage in Isaiah 6 where it begins, in the year that Uzziah died. And Uzziah was a very popular, effective king, and he had ruled over quite a peaceful time, a prosperous time in Israel's history, Judah's history. And then Isaiah, and everyone's worried about, so here's a transition time. And what does that mean for us? And are we going to be invaded by enemies? Or is evil going to find its way into the country, or what might happen? And it was at that context where one of the greatest prophets of all of history, in Isaiah, has an encounter with God that changes his life. And so his mind was all about the transition between monarchs. But after he sees God on his throne, everything changes, and it doesn't really matter who's king. After that, Isaiah is more concerned about what God has for him. So I think it's interesting. Isaiah, if you'd asked him before he encountered God on his throne, what's the most important reality going on right now, he might have said, well, the whole nation's going down the drain here. We've just lost our powerful king figure. But kings come and go, Isaiah discovered. He would serve under a number of them. And so, first of all, just realize, perhaps try to back away from the apocalyptic type language and thoughts, and realize that try to keep your feet on the ground regardless of what happens. And as I said, the second thing, just kind of to reiterate, is that God is not standing for re-election this year, so he will still be in place, in office, as he's always been. And his purposes, his plans, his will continue to be worked out regardless of who is elected and put in the White House. We've said this before, but God's work does not depend on particular governments being in power. God's work depends on him, and he carries out his work regardless of governments. And in fact, oftentimes in history, whether it's been in China or Russia, other places, oftentimes it's when government is actually hostile to Christianity, when you would think that God's purposes would be thwarted with the kind of government in place, that God has done some of his greatest work. So don't think that somehow if the person you wanted to be elected into various offices doesn't get elected, that somehow that's going to thwart God and God won't be able to get his work done. And so I certainly, I'm like everybody else. I have my preferences on who I'd like to see elected, but I want to keep my eye on what God is doing, and realize that it's what he's doing that really matters. And long after whoever is elected in this election is out of office, God will still be in his place and still working. And so a third thing, I think we need to just commit ourselves as Christians to fulfill what God tells us to do in the Bible, and that is to pray for our government leaders, regardless of whether they're the one you voted for. I think as a Christian, if you truly love your country, you're gonna vote for the good of the country. I think we've gotten so polarized now that there's a part of us, or some people, that if their party's not in power, they almost want the country to tank and do poorly, just so that they don't want the ruling party in power to get too much credit or have too much success. And I think we need just to desire what's good for the country. And so
I think it's easy to forget that the Democrats and Republicans are still on the same boat called United States of America.
Yeah. We have the same economy. When rates go up or gas prices go up or whatever, it all dips into our pocket. And when things go down, we all have more disposable income, and so there's just lots of reasons why, we ultimately what we want is best for the country. And so we want to pray for whoever is elected. And I think also something else I think that kind of going along with that is we also need to acknowledge when people do good things. I think sometimes, and I've seen this before, and certainly we have some kind of we have biased news stations and outlets these days, and you'll notice a lot of times, depending on which way a station leans, if it's a president that they don't like, then they just tend to never report the good things that the person does, and they report every even hint of problem or scandal if it's negative. And I think that we need to just acknowledge, like, if someone, maybe it's a president I didn't vote for, but hey, if they do a good thing, like, I need to tip my hat and say, well, at least on this case, they did well. I like this. I like what they did here. It just seems like we've become so polarized. We can't even acknowledge a good thing when it's done. And I would say, no, hey, you when you do good things, I'm going to acknowledge that, be grateful for it. Of course, that I also can disagree when things are done poorly, but I think it's always great. And I know sometimes we're just afraid that we're going to look naive if we give people the benefit of the doubt. But I don't think we're called to be stupid. But I think at the same time, I think we want to desire the best and hope for the best, to pray for the best, and when we see good things, let's acknowledge it and say, well, that is good. And along with that, I would just say too that I think it's not breaking news. The fact that so many news agencies these days are biased. You can just see it so clearly by the way news is reported. There's just so much commentary on it, either negative or positive, and I think there's all kinds of typically conspiracy theories that rage, especially if you didn't get the results that you like. And I'm not saying that there's no evil out there and there's no people conspiring or trying to thwart systems. But I would encourage listeners to be very careful about what kind of news you are soaking in. You can. I think it's always good to recognize the bias of whatever station or person you're listening to, and I think it doesn't hurt to listen to both sides. You might have your preferred news source, but it never hurts to be at least aware of what other sides are saying, other perspectives are seeing the same events, and so be careful, because I know that we tend to. I know after every election, people are kind of listening to all their political gurus that they trust and getting their spin on things, and there may be some real truth in what's being said, but be careful you don't just get led down a path too, where people are kind of doing all your thinking for you and telling you that you should be really alarmed or upset or out in the streets. Try to get just a well-rounded perspective on whatever happens, and then another thing, just to say, don't base your life on politics. Don't let your life be based on, your life is good when your party wins and your life is horrible when your party loses. Hopefully your life is bigger than American politics. And I know some folks that, the way they talk, they literally, it's like life is over if this person is elected or that person's not elected. And it's interesting, a lot of the studies these days are saying that, like Gen Zs, they've largely given up God, or they never known God. They're not very religious, and yet there is a sense in which people need a higher purpose for their life, some higher cause than just living their own comfortable existence. And it seems like, at least for some people, you take away God, you take away the church, nonprofit sort of involvement like that. And for some people, they've kind of embraced politics. That's become their channel for change and making the world a better place. And so they put all their hope and faith in political leaders instead of in God. And that is just a recipe for disaster. I think history would show anytime the government has taken the place of religion, it's never gone well for a nation. And so, be involved in politics, follow it, participate in it, but hopefully your life's bigger than that. And because politics just rarely ever always goes the way you want it to. And so hopefully the joy of your life comes from a greater source than just the last electoral cycle. Yeah. And then just also don't lose relationships over elections. And in recent years, this just seems to be more common, where, literally people are asked not to come to family meals and gatherings because they're just going to argue, or they let's not have your brother-in-law come to Thanksgiving because he'll just go on and on about politics. And it's really kind of sad. And many relationships have been broken, and people just felt they had to post something and rant and rave on social media, and then they got unfriended by even family members. And you just think sometimes, was that issue really so important that you no longer talk to your father? You don't go home for Christmas and see your parents because you disagree on politics? I would just say be careful that politics does not hijack your life and hijack things that really matter, like relationships. Relationships are going to matter more than whether people agree or not with your perspective on the last election. You could have your opinion, but it just seems like in recent days, a lot of people just they're looking for a fight. They're looking for an argument. And so, full well, if you go to that family gathering, you're going to start getting into an argument about politics. And I would just say, as a Christian, I think you're not looking for a fight. You're not looking for an argument. And, I think, as you know, Sam, you're probably, when you go to a family wedding and you start arguing with a cousin, you're probably not going to convince them of your perspective by arguing with them at the wedding. So might as well just put all that aside and just enjoy being family and enjoy the occasion.
Well, and I think when politics has been so elevated in people's lives in recent days, it's hard, I think, for people to get outside of that mentality that sort of politics is life, or is essentially their religion, or their religious practice is.
Yeah. And of course,
politics.
Politicians are constantly hyping up the rhetoric, and it's democracy's at stake, life as we know it is at stake.
This is the last free election.
Yeah, it's like when politicians are constantly talking about that. If this person's elected, they're just going to imprison everyone who voted against them. It's like let's calm things down a little bit, and let's kind of think through some of that. Another thing I would just say is don't gloat. If your party won, if your presidential candidate won, you don't have to gloat about it. You don't have to rub people's nose in it. The moment that it's decided, and especially if your party won, if your candidate won, that's definitely a time to be gracious. That's a time not to blow your own horn. That's not a time to mock and gloat and just deepen the wounds. That's a time to start mending fences and building bridges and being gracious. And so if your party won, then be kind. And I've seen it. I've seen the opposite. I've been on airplanes the day after an election, hearing people talking loud enough for everybody on the plane to hear what they thought and how happy they were, and how what losers the other side were. And I'd say, no, that's a time to just be gracious and reach out. And so going along with that, I'd just say seek to build bridges. Elections these days just seem to deeply divide people. And so I think as Christians, we ought to be known as bridge builders. Again, it doesn't mean you change your opinion, doesn't mean you change your vote, but it means that you vote your conscience, you participate, but at the same time you're trying to build bridges, because Christians ought to be bridge builders, relationship builders, fence menders. And so be looking for ways to build bridges. And then just watch to see what God is doing. It is always interesting to me, because sometimes if someone's party loses, they can really feel like, is the end near? Is my life as I know it radically about to change? Or I was so convinced that God was going to do this, and then He didn't. And it creates opportunities for spiritual conversations. People begin reflecting on their life, reflecting on the future, dealing with disappointment. There are some opportunities around elections for God to do a fresh work in some people's lives. And so, sometimes we can be just so focusing whether our person won or lost that we miss seeing what God is doing. Yeah. And God may actually have an opportunity after an election to do some things in people's lives that perhaps they were closed to before that. And also, just elections can certainly be a time to help people's prayer lives grow. I know some prayer groups that are meeting every week praying for this election, people praying the night before, the morning of, during the day. But I would say don't stop the intensity of your prayer life once the election's over. It's maybe more than ever you need to be praying after the election. So just be interceding along the way and letting God show you how to, by prayer, be joining in what God is doing. And then also, I think sometimes we kind of feel like, well, if my person doesn't win, then, either God can't do anything or the church is in trouble. I've heard that a lot, whether it's, well, we don't have prayer in school anymore, so, it's hard to be the church these days. And I always just kind of think back to, hey, that's great. Wherever Christianity gets some help along the way. But, I think sometimes some of the props that has kind of undergirded the church in the past gets kicked out from under us, and sometimes you think, well, does my faith, does my Christianity need a lot of propping up? Do I need my culture to be supportive of my beliefs? Do I need to always have the person that I like president for me to feel comfortable as a Christian? Or, I always just think of first century Christians that were being persecuted. They were a vast minority. They didn't really have any buildings to speak of. They didn't have "In God We Trust" on their Roman denariuses. They didn't have any of that props. All they had was the Spirit of God working in them, and just a resolute faith and a burning passion to spread the gospel. And they turned their world upside down. And so, I think sometimes I think for many years, I think we've been kind of playing on a bit of a sloped field where things were kind of in our favor as Christians, and society kind of smiled upon a lot of our beliefs, even if they weren't all Christians themselves. There was a lot of respect for a lot of the Christian values and principles, and I think in these election cycles, sometimes we discover, well, I guess it seems like fewer and fewer people that believe just like I do, and you realize, wow, there's a whole half the American population that see things very, very differently than I do. I think for some Christians, they're beginning to sense, well, that's just letting me know I'm increasingly in a minority. I'm not always a part of the majority anymore. I would say, well, Christians, oftentimes, they have flourished the best when they were in a minority. In fact, we actually kind of don't always handle being in a majority very well. We kind of get fat and lazy a lot of times and start taking things for granted when we have too much cultural, political, economic influence. And so, again, I think we just need to be careful to say, well, maybe we're kind of going back to a first century kind of culture where our walk with God may not be propped up with a lot of cultural props anymore. It may just have to be a genuine faith in God and a reliance on the Holy Spirit, and a comfort in being a minority, but with a desire to share truth and be salt and light wherever God takes us. And so, regardless of what happens, we'll certainly be watching into the evening to see as results come in, praying. But I think maybe just the last thing is we talked about building bridges, and that's also, I think, just talk with people that, especially that have a different view than you do, that perhaps voted differently than you. I think we're more and more just getting into our own tribe, and all we do is talk to ourselves. We talk to other people that agree with us, and I think it's just a very healthy thing to have conversations with people. It doesn't mean you agree with them. But when you listen to people that vote differently than you, and you not to argue with them, but ask questions and ask them about, well, why would you do that, and why is that so important, and why are you so upset about this? Sometimes you discover, that they've got some bad information, or they just have a whole different approach to life and how it's supposed to run, but you also realize these are people, and often, most of the time, they mean well. They're not evil. They don't want evil to happen to the country. In their minds, the way they voted is the best way to bring good to the country. And so, try to spend some time with folks that perhaps are different than you. Don't get so isolated that you don't even know anyone that is different than you. I think it's great sometimes when you can just sit down and go for coffee with someone and say, just help me understand your perspective. What led you to this place and where you feel this way and you vote this way? And again, I may not agree, but I would love just to know kind of how you got there and help me understand and get all the rhetoric and stuff aside and just from your heart tell me what you really believe. And I think that would go a long way to just kind of calming things down in the country if more of us did that. And instead of yelling at each other and trying to just ridicule each other, that we try to understand each other. And again, you don't have to agree with someone to understand them, and to respect that people have different opinions. And so, hopefully, I'm really praying that God would just have His hand on this day, where there will not be a lot of. There's always seems to be some aberrations and some different things that happen and that cause people to be suspicious. Well, why did the power go out at the booth for several hours? And what was that truck arriving late at night with a bunch of ballots from and all that kind of stuff? You just pray that God will just kind of keep things going smoothly and things will be above reproach, and then people will just be able to accept the results, and certainly we'll be praying that God will just do what only He can do in just uniting the nation together for a greater good. So we'll see what happens, like everyone else. But just remember, you're still a Christian even before you're an American, and it's the kingdom of God and those values and principles that should be guiding us at first and foremost. And so just don't lose your Christianity over the election cycle, but make sure your Christian values and beliefs and behavior is front and center all through election day and the days that follow.
Yeah, and despite, regardless, I should say, of who wins, that our listeners will be glad to know that we will have another podcast in the following weeks, and we will press on.
Yeah, we will.
Regardless of who's in office. So we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.